NBC. But the attacks appear over, the unspeakable deed done.
And a short time ago, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hugh Shelton, expressed America's resolve with a firm pledge to retaliate against those responsible. The #1 suspect, Osama bin Laden. Now, the military has always had a contingency plans for attacks against a variety of bin Laden targets. Behind me and what's left of this building here tonight, the military is literally dusting off those plans. Tom?
NBC's Jim McLeshesky. Jim, around the world, American military forces still on the highest status of alert?
The highest state of alert, Delta. And a short time after that, military commanders all around the world took the responsibility, went to Delta, which puts those forces on a virtual war footing, prepared for anything.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Jim McLeshesky at the Pentagon tonight. As New York was a target and thrown into chaos in Los Angeles, it was a city stunned by the attack and the fact that 3 of the 4 hijacked airliners were bound for Los Angeles, the other for San Francisco, California. NBC's George Lewis is at Los Angeles International Airport tonight with some of the grieving families and the latest on some of the crash victims that we know about. George?
Yes, Tom, a lot of grieving going on here on the West Coast because all of the people who were lost on those planes were bound for California. Ordinarily, Los Angeles International has 2,100 flights daily, but tonight the airport's completely buttoned up. Nothing taking off or landing. Please. Shocked and grief-stricken, the relatives of those aboard the hijacked flights rushed to the airport, where authorities quickly took them to private rooms. Grief counselors from the Salvation Army joined airline personnel in trying to comfort the families of the passengers.
It's just to be there and to say to them, we are here, and we'll do whatever we can do to help you through this trauma and this pain.
The first plane to crash into the World Trade Center, American Airlines Flight 11, was bound from Boston to Los Angeles, piloted by 52-year-old John Oganowski. This afternoon, his brother spoke to reporters.
I ask all of you for your prayers, for as I refer to him as Brother John. And I ask you to also pray for our whole country today.
Among the well-known passengers on the hijacked planes, the producer of the TV series Frasier, David Angel, and CNN commentator Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. She reportedly called her husband twice on a mobile phone to tell him her plane was being hijacked, that the crew and all the passengers were being herded to the back of the aircraft. And on United Flight 93 from Washington to San Francisco, one of the flight attendants, Cece Myers, also used a cell phone to report that hijacking to her husband, a policeman in Fort Myers, Florida. By midday in Los Angeles, FBI personnel were swarming over the airport checking for possible bombs, but none were found. As a precaution, police and the FBI ordered the airport evacuated.
We're evacuating all terminals and we're stopping traffic all over.
An eerie scene at Los Angeles International tonight, the airport completely empty. And why were all of the hijacked planes California bound? One theory is that the hijackers deliberately chose planes that would have been fully loaded with fuel for a transcontinental flight. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's George Lewis tonight. Now let's go to the reaction around the rest of the country. This day of terror rippling from coast to coast. NBC's Jim Avila is at the Sears Tower in downtown Chicago. Jim?
Tom, Chicago's skyline intact but virtually empty tonight as America's skyscrapers were evacuated through most of the day today. That includes Chicago's Sears Tower, the Arco Towers in Los Angeles, the Bank of America in San Francisco, all waiting for the all clear. The nation's landmarks, America's gathering spots, today abandoned as potential terrorist targets, from the Seattle Space Needle and LA City Hall in the west, to Disney World in the southeast, to the world's biggest shopping mall, the Mall of America in Minneapolis, closed. And of course, at the country's tallest building, Sears Tower, and Michigan Avenue in the Midwest, the symbols of American life frozen in fear.
It's scary. Your family's away from home, your kids at school, so it's very scary.
America hunkered down, Chicago's financial district virtually empty, every sworn police officer in the third largest city ordered to the streets. The nation's workforce turning around and heading home. Larry Hudson works at the Sears Tower.
And I got to the elevator and I said, hey, what am I going up for?
Kelly and David McLean split up to go to work this morning and quickly decided home in front of the television set was the safest spot today.
Now this nation has turned, it's turned upside down. Emotionally, perhaps financially, who knows? It's absolutely, it's one of those moments that you can't believe you actually saw played out.
At America's 5,000 airports, total shutdown.
Ground stop for all airports until 1 o'clock. That means that no airplanes will be leaving any of the airports in the United States.
An estimated 200,000 passengers stranded. At O'Hare, world's busiest, a line of jets held on the runway for hours. No open gates, but surprisingly few complaints.
Being upset about missing my plane, that's trivial compared to people that were on the plane and in the buildings.
Military planes like this one in San Francisco escorting the last of the commercial jetliners safely to the ground. But a crippled air travel system is more than inconvenience. Aviation expert Mike Boyd.
Air transportation is part of our communication system. Today it's shut down entirely. People aren't moving A to B, goods aren't moving, mail isn't moving. And because of that, we're probably going to have a tens of billions of dollar hit on our economy for this quarter.
Phone service strangled too. America's largest cell phone network, with cell towers atop the World Trade Center destroyed, reports call volume nationally doubled.
We can't compare today's events to anything that we've experienced before. We've withstood earthquakes, hurricanes, significant floods, but nothing like today's event.
Get your 12 extra right here.
In Chicago, 800 miles from the attacks, Karen Davis frustrated in her attempt to work at home.
I could not get a signal on my way home, and then I couldn't get a signal on my home phone when I got here. Just really frustrating not to be able to get in contact with anybody.
Among the events canceled tonight, Major League Baseball postponing games from coast to coast. NBC's Tonight Show called off, and the Emmys, scheduled for Sunday, canceled too.
We all could see the gravity of the situation and realize this is a true national nightmare come true, and that a celebration and a comedy show would just not be something that would be appropriate for this country this weekend.
We cannot let it happen again.
Most of the nation's schools stayed open through the tragic day, students watching terrorism on their own shores for the first time.
And I just was asking myself over and over why they did this.
Teachers trying to make sense of it.
There are other places in the world where this is commonplace, and for us it's a first.
At this hospital in suburban Chicago, Americans responding by lining up to donate blood. Midday church services more crowded than normal.
I guess I'm just looking for a peace in my heart and for peace in other people's hearts and from all the destruction.
Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
At SMU in Dallas, older students sing the national anthem at an outdoor rally, mixing tears and patriotism. Experts say Americans should expect a jump in the national anxiety level.
They may be irritable, they may be really very acutely aware of their environment around them and any kind of threats to them.
Also tonight, some of the first effects of the fear in the economic fashion. Already today, there's been problems with gas gouging. In fact, gas prices have gone up in Kansas to as much as $5 a gallon. Tom?
NBC Jim Avila tonight reporting on the length and breadth of this country from Chicago, the heartland of America. Told now we have a tracking tape. It shows the pattern of the flight that went into the first of the twin trade towers. It took off from Boston. That would be Flight 11 American Airlines. And then you can see that sharp left turn as it heads for New York, well off course. And the second plane headed now going from New York, and then this is the second one that comes into New York. The second one goes from Newark to Pennsylvania, where it went down. There's still some uncertainty about whether that was going to be directed by the hijackers into one of the other many government or financial buildings that could have been a target for it, either in the Washington, D.C. or New York area. We don't know for sure. Of course, for many Americans tonight, the anger and the rage that they feel is directed at one man that they have never seen except on some vague videotape. Osama bin Laden, the world's best-known Islamic extremist. He's on almost everyone's list of the most likely suspects for today's attacks, and NBC's Keith Miller has more on him tonight from London for us. Keith?
Tom, he is one of the most dangerous terrorists on the planet. The U.S. government has put a $5 million bounty on his head.
Osama bin Laden was last seen publicly this January at his son's wedding in Afghanistan. Rare pictures of a man who reportedly travels only at night, often in disguise, surrounded by bodyguards. He made his reputation in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
He was involved in some horrific battles, which he said later gave him a sort of tranquility and a sense of peace. And it basically made him a pretty fearless guy.
Today, the Central Intelligence Agency calls him the most immediate and serious threat to U.S. security. Bin Laden says the jihad against the United States and killing of Americans is the core of his faith. He was born into a family of wealth, power, and privilege in Saudi Arabia 44 years ago. It was during his days as a student studying economics that he turned to radical Islam. He is linked to a series of global terrorist attacks. February 1993, the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, 6 dead, more than 1,000 injured. August 7, 1998, the simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, more than 200 killed. And last year, the suicide bomb attack on the USS Cole, resulting in the death of 17 American servicemen.
He alone, probably within the Islamic world, has amassed and developed a terrorist network, an international network, which would be capable of carrying out such an atrocity.
After the embassy bombing, the American government retaliated with missile strikes. The missiles damaged bin Laden's headquarters in Afghanistan, but he escaped unharmed. The U.S. has demanded that the radical Islamic government in Afghanistan hand bin Laden over to American authorities. But the Afghans have refused, despite bin Laden's declaration that all U.S. citizens are legitimate targets.
He's targeted the US because he sees America as the head of the snake, as he calls it. The body of the snake is the corrupt governments in the Middle East that he has promised to overthrow, and also Israel.
Meanwhile, his popularity in the region is reportedly increasing. Recently, an estimated 25,000 followers scattered around the world and prepared to engage in a holy war against America.
From Afghanistan tonight, a statement from the government claiming bin Laden didn't do it. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence officials say he was last seen near Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan, but because he moves at least 3 times a week, he will remain difficult to catch. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Keith Miller tonight. We want to give you an update now. The President of the United States will be addressing this nation on this difficult day at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight. And of course, we will bring that to you live. There are people around the world who do not wish America well. We know that as a result of today's attacks, but also on the basis of their reaction to what happened here today. Some of them are even celebrating. With that story, here's NBC's Martin Fletcher in Tel Aviv. Martin?
Tom, Israel is declaring a day of mourning tomorrow in solidarity with the United States, but not all reaction here has been so sympathetic. There's a sense here among some Palestinians that America had it coming. These Palestinians in East Jerusalem today delighted at the bombings and American loss of life, offering cakes and sweets, calling out, "God is great." Thousands more celebrate in other West Bank towns until Palestinian police disperse them. The Palestinian leader, however, stunned and sympathetic.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
But the voice of the street reflects anger at America's role, especially in Israel and Iraq.
We should show America that they should learn and they should know what is to attack somebody like Iraq. It should be more.
And many Arabs furious at American support for Israel. This man holds up an American-made bomb part fired by American-made aircraft used by Israel. American support for Israel, some believe, makes America a legitimate target for terrorism. Many also angry at years of almost daily American bomb attacks against Iraq, which didn't stop with the end of the Gulf War a decade ago. And US troops still in Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden, the prime suspect in today's terror attacks, angry at American support for what he calls the tyrannical government of Saudi Arabia, his homeland, and for America's close ties with Israel. In almost a year of unrest, more than a dozen Palestinian suicide bombers and other attackers have killed 170 Israelis, while Israel has killed more than 570 Palestinians. A conflict that always threatens to suck neighboring countries into the fighting. Israel tonight called for an international war against terrorism.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life.
Today, the leader of Hamas, the Islamic militants who send most suicide bombers against Israel, called on America to change its policies. Sheikh Yassin said America is behind injustices in many parts of the world, but then he said Hamas doesn't support attacks against civilians. Tonight, Israel closed its airspace to foreign airlines and then closed its land borders to prevent any possible terrorist attacks. There's a sense here that Palestinian militants may try to take advantage of the confusion to kill more Israelis. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Martin Fletcher. An already very complex and volatile situation in the Middle East is even more so tonight. Now to a different kind of problem. The World Trade Center towers were some of the most famous buildings in the world, of course. They've survived hurricanes, fires, and even one previous terrorist bombing. NBC's Roger O'Neill talked to the architect of those buildings and how they were put up and what brought them down.
Hyman Brown was the project engineer on the Twin Towers, the man on the ground in charge of making sure the buildings were built right, the way it was designed.
There was a lot of pride in it, and we were doing something that hadn't been done before. But no one ever considered any types of forces like this.
Brown, who spent 6 years building the towers from day one in 1966, says the planes didn't cause the towers to collapse, but rather the fire and tremendous heat that exposed the steel superstructure to forces it could not withstand.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
Each tower was built around a central core. That core kept the building up, supporting the tower's so-called dead weight. But when steel melts, according to Brown, like dominoes, it falls. Brown says the towers were built to withstand 200-mile-an-hour hurricanes, the 100-year storm, the worst nature could dish out. But he says an airplane crash never entered anyone's mind. Still, it appears the outside columns, made of prefabricated steel, absorbed most of the energy from the planes and may have kept the two towers from collapsing immediately. University of Colorado engineering professor Stein Stur thinks the energy from those large planes would be equivalent to a medium 5 or 6 Richter scale earthquake.
As the airplanes came in and hit, energy was absorbed tremendously. Some of that core may have been damaged tremendously, and maybe this was part cause to this implosion.
The way the towers collapsed seems similar to pictures we've become accustomed to watching, as old buildings like the Kingdome in Seattle are taken down with explosives. Mark Loazza, whose controlled demolition company does that sort of work, says once a building starts falling, it releases a lot of stored energy.
We use explosives as a catalyst to release that potential energy, converts it into kinetic energy, gets the building moving.
NBC's Roger O'Neill tonight on the stunning destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center here in Manhattan as a result of a terrorist attack. All hour long we've been trying to bring you Rahema Ellis and her diary of what she went through during the day, and we're going to do that for you right now.
New York City's Brooklyn Bridge, normally clogged with vehicles, today an escape route. It's 11:45 in the morning, and there is a mass exodus from downtown New York City. You can take a look and you can see hundreds of thousands of people leaving the area. Police are evacuating this particular area. Were you afraid for your life?
Completely terrified. We were all crying, hysterical. We were wanting to get out of there and not knowing where to go and which direction to run in and how far we can go. And I'm still worried about my life. Yeah. it's horrifying.
Putting civilians on the bus, get on if you want.
Another sign of how quickly people deserted the area. This is a fruit stand only about 8 to 10 blocks away from the World Trade Center. Normally there would be people crowded in the streets trying to buy some fruit from a man who may have worked here. Now it's deserted, nothing is left but his fruit covered in ash. What went through your head when you saw that?
Still completely devastated, completely.
Devastation.
People jumped out of the windows. It was indescribable.
I'm watching the thing, and all of a sudden it starts crashing, this tremendous noise, and instinct obviously tells you to turn the other way and run, which we all did. People were getting trampled and bleeding.
We're now just a block away from the World Trade Center, and the closer we get to ground zero, the harder it is to breathe and to see. You have to wear a mask and you need to wear some sort of glasses, otherwise it is choking and blinding smoke. Behind me, ordinarily you would be able to see the Twin Towers, but today all you can see is the thick black smoke that is clouding the area. All on the street there is this thick ash. It's at least an inch thick. There are paper strewn all over everywhere. And the area literally is deserted, with the exception of the emergency workers who are continually trying to push people away from the area for their own safety. What do you think this is?
I have no idea.
But your guess is?
Pulverized cement.
Pulverized cement?
Concrete, yeah.
The concrete. These firefighters, just some of the hundreds, waiting for their turn to go into the World Trade Center area. Already they are covered in soot, tired, and worried about what they're going to see when they get to ground zero.
What happened to you?
I was inside the building trying to get people out when the building fell.
When do you think that we will be able to begin to go in and start to really search for some of the victims inside?
They're searching right now on a limited basis. As soon as they get organized, we'll be sending more and more people in to do more and more work.
NYU Downtown Hospital has the only emergency room in Lower Manhattan. The first victims from the blast were brought here. The cafeteria has been turned into a triage area. Hospital officials say there are victims wall to wall. 8 years ago, this hospital took in the first victims from the World Trade Center bombing. Officials here say they try to plan for disasters. 2 weeks ago, they went through an emergency drill, but no one ever imagined they'd be tested so soon. Rahima Ellis, NBC News in Lower Manhattan.
NBC's Rahima Ellis, who is in the middle of it all. We want to remind you that we'll have continuing coverage until 1 tomorrow morning on this NBC station. The President of the United States, his speech to the nation at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight. It has now been about 11 hours since the first attack on the Twin Trade Towers and the stunning sequence of events that followed. It all happened so rapidly and in plain view that it somehow seemed surreal, more a television image than the cold-blooded, calculated acts of terrorism that in fact it was. This is a day without end, for we do not know yet the full price in lives lost, whether there are other targets to come, and most important, how we will respond to this terrorist attack, how we strike back militarily, how we defend ourselves at home, how we heal all the wounds of this day. America has been attacked, and it has been changed. This is the first great test of the new century for this nation, for its new president. It's also a great test for us all, wherever we live, whatever our age, whatever our beliefs. Tonight, as we remind you, we'll have continuing coverage. We want to share with you now the images and the sounds of this unforgettably dark day in America. It was the ultimate act of terrorism. 2 hijacked planes crashing into the World Trade Center, collapsing what was once one of the tallest buildings in the world, leaving a scene some described as a nuclear winter. Good evening, everyone. It was one of the darkest days in America through the day and into the night, and it is not over. New York and the nation will never be the same. What was once a symbol of America's might is tonight a scene of utter devastation. Piles of rubble, acres of gray ash, a death toll that some estimate could reach into the thousands. Hundreds of rescue workers, very little hope in the rubble of the World Trade Center. And this is the scene tonight at the Pentagon, hit by another hijacked plane shortly after the attack on the World Trade Center. The Pentagon says it does not yet know how many people were killed or injured. President Bush, facing the first and largest crisis of his presidency, one of the largest crises of any modern president, first got word of this attack while he was in Florida today. He then flew to a secure underground bunker near Omaha, the Strategic Air Command headquarters, before returning tonight to the White House and an address to the nation at 8:30. In a brief statement earlier, the president said freedom itself was attacked this morning and freedom will be defended. Make no mistake, he said, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for what he called these cowardly acts. Tonight, over the next 3 hours, we will be looking for answers to some of the questions we all were asking today. How could this happen? What do we do now? How can we prevent it from happening again? How will it change us? We start tonight with NBC's Campbell Brown, who joins us from near the White House. Campbell?
Tom, the president is now preparing his speech to the nation. Aides tell us it will be a message of resolve and reassurance that our nation has been tested before and has always prevailed. Since Bush arrived here at the White House about 7 p.m. Eastern Time, he has been huddled with his national security team. He did speak with them earlier today when he was in Nebraska by a live teleconference, and this is according to White House aides. He told his team, quote, "We will find these people and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation. We will do what it takes. No one is going to diminish the spirit of this country." We are also told by aides that a point he will make tonight is that he wants Americans to return to their lives, to demonstrate that this has not affected the American spirit. This will not diminish the country. Now, Tom, obviously the president's security today was a top priority, and that's why he was shuttled across the country on Air Force One today, as you said, beginning in Sarasota, Florida, where he was first informed, then flying to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. From there, going to Nebraska, to the U.S. Strategic Command Center, where he addressed his national security team, then back to the White House. Aides tell us there is a plan in place when they believe there is a threat to the president, and that today they implemented that plan, moving him around on Air Force One and deliberately not telling us where he would be going at any point in time. They also say that gave the president's national security team, Vice President Dick Cheney and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who were here at the White House in the Situation Room, that gave them time to assess the threat, to gather information, and they say it was the president who made the decision to return to Washington to address the nation tonight. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. There was an exceptional bipartisan appearance on the steps of the Capitol tonight. Members of the congressional leadership, Republican and Democrat, House and Senate, gathered to say that we stand fully behind the president. And then, as Tim Russert was witness to all of this as well, Tim, they broke into God Bless America.
Tom, an extraordinary scene here in Washington. 24 hours ago, rancor, bipartisanship, not tonight. National unity, indeed a new tone in Washington. The notion of a lockbox for Social Security seems so minuscule to people now across the country and even here in Washington. They understand what this has meant. That's why all eyes on the president tonight. Democrats and Republicans have told him, Mr. President, whatever you say, we are behind you.
All right, Tim Russert, we'll ask you to stand by there throughout the evening. We're going to go to the Pentagon now, and our Pentagon correspondent, Jim Miklashevsky, who was on duty this morning when he said there seemed to have been an explosion at the Pentagon. We now know that it was a hijacked airliner crashing into that building. Jim, do we have any sense tonight of the death toll or the casualty list at the Pentagon?
No, it's going to run into the scores. There were more than 60 people on the plane and an undetermined number of people still buried beneath the rubble here behind us. Searchers have entered the building. They've been in there for about 5 hours now, Tom. There is no exact casualty toll that's been released. They've set up a temporary morgue inside the center courtyard of the Pentagon for tonight. But in the meantime, there was also an expression of resolve here at the Pentagon from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hugh Shelton, who reaffirmed America's resolve and issued a firm pledge to retaliate against those responsible. And the Pentagon has always had contingency plans to attack a variety of targets of the known terrorist, Osama bin Laden. And we've been told that military planners are taking a close look at those contingencies tonight, Tom.
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, and joining me now is former Secretary of the Treasury, former Secretary of State, former White House Chief of Staff, James Baker, who was deeply involved, of course, in the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st President of the United States during the Persian Gulf War. Obviously, the highest priority must be assigned to finding out who is responsible for this, Mr. Baker, but then describe for us, sketch for us, if you will, in diplomatic terms, what the first steps ought to be.
Well, I think there are a number of steps, Tom, that have to be taken. First of all, we need to look at our intelligence gathering capabilities. We need to look at the security measures and standards at our airports. And then, of course, we do have contingency plans for striking back. There really are not a lot of easy answers in that regard, but we do have contingency plans. All of the administrations I've served have had those plans. This administration has them, and I'm sure they will implement them. And we are pretty good at that kind of operation if we can pinpoint exactly who was responsible for this atrocious series of events.
And do we dispatch special emissaries to the Middle East, to Tel Aviv, also to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan and the other Arab states there, so that we can get everybody calmed down?
Well, we will probably be doing that, whether it's through the use of special emissaries or not. I don't know. It doesn't have to be special emissaries. I think we ought not to rush too quickly to the judgment here that this happened because there was a lull in the peace process in the Middle East, particularly if it's Osama bin Laden, and that would be my #1 suspect. He's been at this for quite some time. He took out our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. He took out the Khobar Towers, or had some role in it. And so I don't think we ought to draw the connection too quickly between the absence of progress in the peace process in the Middle East and what happened to America today. I think these people that did this have been dead set for a long time on a terrorist attack against America. They've succeeded, unfortunately. It's really rather amazing that they were able to do what they did with respect to the commercial airliners. We haven't had a hijacking in this country, I don't think, of an airliner for over 10 years. So we need to take some careful looks at what happened, exactly what happened, and what we can do to prevent it in the future. Let me just say one final thing. When I was in government at high levels, and I was here for 12 years in Washington, D.C., we foreclosed a lot of similar type attacks that had been planned, maybe not as sophisticated as this one, but we rolled up a lot of operations, and generally speaking, the counterintelligence and counterterrorism capabilities of the United States have functioned very effectively. We may, however, now be entering into a new era, and we may have to see some significant new measures.
But that's my very point. Take it out of the context of what's going on between Israel and the PLO. A lot of the moderate Arab states have been targets for this same kind of fanatic activity as well.
That's correct. And when there is violence in the Middle East, when there is terrorism, the more moderate states, whether they're Arab states or the United States or our allies in Europe, we tend to be diminished, because those who argue for peace and those who support peace are hurt when the rejectionists and the radicals succeed. And that's, of course, what this is. This is success by the radical elements at the very highest levels.
All right, thank you very much. James Baker, former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury, and of course, White House Chief of Staff during the Reagan administration, who has seen more than his share of crises. But he was looking out the window of his Washington law office today and looked on in disbelief as he saw smoke billowing up from the Pentagon, not realizing at the moment, of course, that it had been the target of a direct hit by a hijacked airliner. And on board that airliner, by the way, was Barbara Olson, a well-known Washington lawyer. Well, this is the scene in New York tonight. This is a city that is still hurting very deeply. The New York City Firefighters Union says tonight, these are unconfirmed numbers, but it's from the Firefighters Union, that it has lost, and the city has lost, 200 of its finest. 200 firemen killed today in the World Trade Center attack. The buildings came down, of course. Many of those firemen were at the base of those buildings, involved in firefighting and rescue efforts at the time. That's the first number that we've had from a reliable source that comes from the Firefighters Union tonight. Earlier, Mayor Giuliani would only say that he expected the death toll to be horrendous. At one point, they had 1,500 people being treated at Liberty Park, which is at the tip of Manhattan. This will be going on throughout the evening in New York. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now and see what the very latest is on the hijacking of these 4 planes today, 2 from Boston, 1 from Newark, and 1 from Washington Dulles. Robert?
Tom, there are little glimmers coming out of what may have gone on in the cockpits of some of these planes. The Attorney General John Ashcroft in his news conference this evening mentioned knives when he was talking about the first of these planes to be hijacked, the American airliner out of Boston Logan that was the first to go into World Trade Center number 1. There were several cell phone calls from planes. You mentioned Barbara Olson, the wife of Solicitor General Theodore Olson. She called her husband twice before the plane that she was on, which was one that left Dulles and was bound for Los Angeles, before that plane crashed into the Pentagon. And she mentioned people in the back of the plane with knife-like devices. There was another person who called a relative from a plane and said that the passengers and the pilots of that plane had been herded into the back and that the terrorists were at the controls of the aircraft. We haven't heard guns mentioned yet, but presumably those were weapons too taken aboard, but no one has confirmed that at all at this point. Other cell phone calls monitored from people. There was one unconfirmed report of a flight attendant on that first flight, the Boston flight, who called and said that the crew had been killed and that she'd been locked in the restroom, and then they didn't hear any more from her. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager tonight. Robert, let me just catch up with you quickly. Tomorrow, we do expect that air travel will resume at noon Eastern time. But what should travelers expect in terms of security at airports? Oh,
it will be very, very strong, and I'm not sure they'll actually do it at noon Eastern time is what we've heard, but we simply said that there was not going to be, this is the FAA said, any more travel until noon tomorrow, and then they would reassess at that point. So we don't know for sure that they'll resume at noon.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. This day, it's the 11th of September, the year 2001. Some people have said the 9th month, the 11th day, 911, is a day that will be in bold print in future history books, a day that is a dark mark for this country, a day that everyone will remember where they were when they heard the news. After all, our largest city and most vital financial market immobilized, the country terrorized politically and psychologically. Dateline's Stone Phillips tonight takes us through this astonishing day, minute by minute.
Today, the unimaginable happened. At the start of a busy workday, New Yorkers heard an explosion, then looked up to see a symbol of America's economic power, one of the World Trade Center's twin towers, billowing smoke and flames.
Yeah, the glass, just flames exploded out the front of the World Trade Center. Glass flew everywhere.
Minutes later, literally from out of the blue, an even more horrifying sight. A jetliner bearing down on the other tower. It was a direct hit.
A second airplane, a 727, just ran into the building.
Before the hour was out, the symbol of American military power, the Pentagon, was also in flames. It too apparently the target of a new weapon, a passenger jet hijacked and turned into a guided missile. Across the country, shock, sorrow, fear, outrage, and the realization that America was under attack. About 8:45 this morning, the sky over Manhattan was clear following a night of violent thunderstorms. In the city's financial district, the very heart of American commerce, thousands of workers were already at their desks. Moments later, in the upper reaches of the 110-story North Tower, sudden impact.
As Matt just mentioned, we have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
1 second after the sound started, there was gray smoke and what looked to be like confetti flying all over the place.
Fire and death above, confusion below, as some 10,000 people streamed out of the building.
There was a lady had a big gash on her head, so it was people stampeding one over top of another.
Witnesses reported a horrifying scene. Desperate people jumping from the burning skyscraper. Bloody clothing and body parts scattered on the streets below. As emergency crews rushed to the southern tip of Manhattan, the immediate thought, could it really be happening again?
Step back, okay?
In 1993, the same building was hit by a truck bomb, Islamic militants hoping to topple the one tower into the other. 6 people died in that attack, and 1,500 were injured. But within the first minutes today, it was clear that the toll this time would be much higher. Then, at 9:03, less than 20 minutes after the first strike, with police and rescue personnel still scrambling to respond, this.
There were many people in the building.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on this shot.
Live cameras trained on the first stricken tower captured another huge explosion, this one on the South Tower. Only this time, the attack was documented. This indelible image to be replayed again and again, seared into the American memory.
And here it comes right there.
An American Airlines 767 with 92 people on board hijacked on its flight from Boston to Los Angeles, becoming the implement of mass murder. The impact was devastating, the airliner punching through the skin of the huge tower, another rain of glass, concrete, and terror.
It's like this unbelievable ball of fire. And the whole street, which is now awakened, everyone's like, whoa. People start crying, people start running.
It was now clear that this was no accident. The first tower had also been hit by a hijacked passenger jet, a United flight that had also taken off from Boston, bound for LA. The attacks left New York virtually paralyzed. Tunnels and bridges linking the city shut down, subways closed, telephone lines jammed, cell phones overloaded as frantic callers tried to contact loved ones. At 9:30, President Bush in Florida to talk about education addressed a nation reeling and in need of reassurance.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
But even as the president pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible, another attack, this one even more audacious. The target, the Pentagon. Another American Airlines jet bound for Los Angeles had been hijacked, this one taking off from Washington's Dulles Airport. It was another direct hit. NBC's Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklashevsky suddenly found himself on the front lines of a war that had come home.
I don't want to alarm anybody right now, but apparently it felt just a few moments ago like there was an explosion of some kind here at the Pentagon.
9:43 a.m. With concern that the White House could be a target, President Bush boarded Air Force One bound for a special secure command post at a military base. At 9:49, the Federal Aviation Administration announced it was shutting down the nation's air traffic. In a world turned upside down, hundreds of passenger planes crisscrossing the country were now potential terrorist weapons.
The Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport.
This morning, on a scale beyond belief, Americans experienced what it's like to feel truly vulnerable, to realize when someone is willing to die for a cause, we are all potential targets. The number one suspect, This man, Osama bin Laden, a radical Islamic terrorist linked to past attacks on American interests. A London-based Arab journalist said today that 3 weeks ago, followers of bin Laden warned of a huge and unprecedented attack on the U.S. Was this it?
Somebody provided the logistical support for this operation, and clearly the only person, or one of the only people, that has built up such a network in the world today is Osama bin Laden.
There was no word from bin Laden, but the Taliban-ruled government of Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, issued a statement this morning condemning the attacks and saying bin Laden did not have the capability to carry out such acts. And there were plenty of other suspects, ranging from radical Palestinian groups to rogue governments.
President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks.
While the nation's intelligence community ran down possible suspects and tried to assess whether more attacks were imminent, rescue workers in New York and Washington confronted a disaster of immense proportions. In New York, local hospitals began filling up, urgent calls going out to every available surgeon and nurse, long lines of people outside waiting to donate blood.
It was a war zone. It was just unbelievable.
And still, there was worse to come. At 9:59 a.m., the Trade Center's South Tower, the building that took the second hit, began to crumble.
Everyone get back!
It was almost incomprehensible. In a matter of seconds, the skyscraper collapsed and was gone.
Suddenly, we hear, the security say, everyone get out now, everyone run for your life.
NBC producer Shahar Baran was there with a home video camera.
A bunch of women just standing there, shocked. By then, the whole building sort of implodes. It just goes like this. And you see like a side of the building, and then it goes, and there's this ball, this silver yellow ball sort of heading towards you, kind of in slow motion. You can't figure out what to do. People are starting to run like crazy.
If you take a look behind
Then at 10 a.m., news of another passenger plane in trouble. Someone on United Airlines Flight 93, traveling from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, called 911 and reported a hijacking. Then an explosion and silence. The plane crashed here, some 80 miles outside of Pittsburgh. There were 45 people on board. So far, 3 passenger jets used kamikaze style, and a 4th that might have been. 266 people on board killed. The death toll on the ground still unclear. Then, at 10:30, another sickening sight. The tower still standing, following its twin, collapsing, vanishing in a cloud of smoke. By 11 o'clock, the sense of alarm had spread across the country. Troops standing guard as national landmarks were shut down. Fighter jets actually patrolling the skies as the last airborne passenger planes rushed to safety. 11:14, officials trying to manage the disaster, struggling to describe it all.
First of all, Chief, do we have any idea of how many people are in there?
We have no idea. Now, as you know, it was pretty much rush hour time that this took place this morning, so the numbers we don't know yet. We tried to get almost everybody out that we could early on.
10,000 people in each tower would typically be in there on a normal business day. And we get about another 5,000 visitors during the course of the entire day. So by 8:30, 9 o'clock, the building should have been full.
And New Yorkers were struggling too.
And now they both collapsed. There's no more World Trade Centers.
At 11:42, another plane from Boston declared an emergency. Fearing a bomb on board, it landed in Cleveland. Soon, all planes in Canada as well as the U.S. were grounded. The borders with Mexico and Canada were sealed, and Major League Baseball announced the cancellation of all games scheduled for today. At 1:12, President Bush, at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, again spoke to the nation.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Moments after his speech, the president reboarded Air Force One for a then undisclosed location. Meanwhile, in New York, an army of rescue workers and volunteers from the city's building trades and other unions made their way to the wreckage of Lower Manhattan, seeking the injured and dead.
You guys going back?
Yes. It's our job.
You worried about that other tower?
Personally, I am. I got fellow officers that might be trapped. I'm not trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
Those civilians who could made their way by foot across the Brooklyn Bridge, as New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani called for calm in a city that was more shell-shocked than terrified.
And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal.
The mayor's news conference gave the first hint of just how high the casualty count could be.
There are over 1,000 rescue workers, probably about 2,000 that are deployed, trying to get into the buildings, trying to find people, trying to search for people. The governor and I spoke a couple of hours ago. The governor has deployed the National Guard to relieve them because our people are going to need reinforcements pretty soon.
Just before 3 p.m., President Bush landed at Offutt Air Force Base outside of Omaha. From an underground bunker at the Strategic Air Command Base, he convened a National Security Council briefing. As 4 o'clock approached, the president's spokesperson, Karen Hughes, briefed reporters back in Washington.
The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington.
5:21 p.m., even as people around the country struggled with the enormity of today's events, a third building at the World Trade Center, damaged by this morning's attacks, collapsed.
They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way, please. Be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No.
Fortunately, the building with more than 40 floors had been evacuated. But once again, the concrete canyons of Lower Manhattan were filled with the sounds of sirens and the sight of people fleeing for their lives.
That's Stone Phillips with a riveting account of all that happened today. And what you see behind me is the scene in Lower Manhattan tonight, live as the rescue efforts do continue. So does the fire and the smoke. 3 buildings now have been collapsed as a result of this terrorist attack today. Let's go to NBC's Pat Dawson, who's been on duty there all day long as we await the President of the United States. Pat, very quickly, bring us up to date on recovery efforts.
The recovery efforts at this point, Tom, still pretty much the bottom line is it's a rather chaotic situation here. New York City Fire Department Lieutenant was just giving us some information a few minutes ago and said that there are still fires burning down there, still some underground fires. He told us that there was a rather significant fire in that building that Stone was just describing, number 7 World Trade Center, that collapsed late in the afternoon. As he said, there are still fires burning there. They are trying at this point to get to those fires and to extinguish them, as well as the task, obviously, of looking for anyone who might possibly have survived, although at this point, that is a very, very difficult thing to do in the darkness and the smoke and rubble that this fire lieutenant said runs several stories high in there. Just making a point, or coming on about a point that you mentioned before, as the New York City Firefighters Union saying that fully half of the firefighters originally responding to the events early this morning were killed. That would fit with information that we had gotten from one of the chiefs who was in charge of that operation, saying that he knew he had lost at least 50 to 60 men and probably far fewer that he was not able to evacuate. Tom?
All right, thank you, Pat Dawson, bringing us up to date on the rescue efforts that continue underway as we look at the scenes that have been described all day long by so many people who were there either as a war zone or reminiscent of a nuclear winter. The President of the United States will address the nation, presumably from the Oval Office tonight, after certainly the most hectic day of his presidency, one of the most difficult days of any modern president. He began in Florida earlier, went to Shreveport, addressed the nation from there at Barksdale Air Force Base, then to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, to the very secure bunker with all the most sophisticated communications equipment in the world at his disposal for a meeting of the National Security Council. And then he felt strongly that he wanted to come back to the nation's capital, to Washington, D.C. It was symbolically and politically important for him to address the nation from there tonight, that symbol of freedom and power, the Oval Office of the President of the United States in the West Wing of the White House. We'll be sharing with you, after we hear from the President, also the appearance tonight on the steps of the Capitol of the House and Senate members who were still in town, Republican and Democrat alike, the leaders. There they are, and after their statement by their leaders, they broke into this spontaneous rendition of God Bless America. NBC's Tim Russert is standing by with me as well. Tim, this is going to be a great test, not just for the president, but for his entire staff and, of course, for the political leadership on both sides on Capitol Hill. Let's go now, Tim. I'm sorry, we'll get to that later. Here now is the President of the United States in the Oval Office. We expect to hear from him momentarily.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
President George W. Bush, in his second address to the nation, and certainly the most grave speech that he has made in his very young presidency, as he talked tonight about the terrorists attempting to shatter steel in buildings but not being successful in shattering the steel of resolve in this country, saying the bright light of freedom will continue to burn. He was a sorrowful and sober president, but also one filled with resolve, as he said, we will find the people who are responsible for this and bring them to justice. This has been a long and difficult day for the president, and it's just the beginning, because there are many complex decisions that remain ahead of him now. NBC's Tim Russert joins me now from the Washington Bureau, where he is our Washington Bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press. Tim, the president tomorrow will obviously be sending out a lot of directives to his military, to his law enforcement officers, and also to the people who are responsible for this nation's security at airports and in other places.
Tom, the president cast this tonight as a battle between good and evil, using the word evil several times. Law enforcement officials and intelligence officials hope that with the cockpit recorders, airport records, and perhaps even some celebrations or proclamations by those who did this, they can quickly determine just who must be retaliated against. The president also said something very important, Tom. Whoever harbors these terrorists will be dealt with in the same way as those who committed the terrorism. That is a very important signal and message to people all across the world. Tom, there's a steely resolve in Washington, a passionate determination to bring these people to justice, but there's also a sober realization that our way of life will change forever.
All right, NBC's Tim Russert, who's our Washington Bureau chief. Tim, we're going to ask you to stand by there tonight. I want to go to Richard Holbrooke now, who has been one of our most skilled negotiators and veteran diplomats. He was obviously deeply involved in the Dayton Peace Accords. He was the man who made that happen and tried to bring some sense of peace to the Balkans. Around the world, Mr. Holbrooke, there seems to be this dividing line between Islamic fundamentalists and the United States, not just in the Middle East, but of course in the central part of Europe and in the southeast part of Asia as well.
First of all, I think it's very important to make clear that when you say Islamic fundamentalists, you're not talking about all people who follow Islam as a religion, and I know you and I share that, Tom. But I agree with what Tim Russert just said. The most important sentence in the president's fine speech, which we've all just listened to and which I think the world should understand the president has spoken for the entire nation, regardless of party. The most important sentence in the president's speech was the phrase, "We make no distinction between those who committed the act and those who harbor the people who committed it." And it is absolutely critical now that the United States rally an international coalition so that we don't go it alone in seeking out these people. If, as you have been reporting, it comes from Osama bin Laden, and if the Taliban have left him in their country, they must suffer the consequences. And we're going to need the support of our European allies, of the Russians, the Chinese, and of the Arab moderate states like Egypt and Jordan, which all must join us in the effort to eradicate this scourge that is upon us. As Tim Russert said, it's going to be difficult. but it is something that we must do with other countries to isolate the people who did it.
Richard, no one knows better than you that that's a daunting diplomatic assignment. The last time that that happened successfully, we had a highly conspicuous presence in Saddam Hussein, who had moved into Kuwait, and President George Herbert Walker Bush, this president's father, and his very skilled team did manage to put together an extraordinary alliance. Will it be more difficult this time?
It will be more difficult, Tom, for a reason that's quite clear. We know what the act of war was, and it is an act of war, but not only do we not know exactly who did it, although we have our suspicions, but finding them will be much more difficult than driving an overt, highly visible force out of Kuwait. And we must remember that it took George Bush Sr. 7 long months from August 1st, 1990 until the beginning of 1991 before he launched that military attack. The American public and the world is going to want some kind of action earlier than that, but we'll have to know who it must be directed against. Still, the President's critical statement just now that we'll make no distinction between those who did it and those who are harboring the men who did it is, I think, a big first step towards changing the rules of the game so that people like this can no longer hide behind the kind of horrible behavior that the Taliban have shown in this situation.
Richard Holbrooke, our former ambassador to the United Nations, former ambassador to Germany, a leading State Department authority, and the principal architect of the Dayton Peace Accords for Bosnia. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Tom.
General Norman Schwarzkopf, of course, knows a good deal about putting together an alliance and striking back hard in the Persian Gulf War. He was the commander of the Allied forces there, but this is a far different situation that we face now, General Schwarzkopf.
No question about it. No question about it. But I, just like everyone else, was delighted to hear that statement about going after those people who harbor these terrorists, too. That applies not only to the people abroad, but people in our own country who do that.
General Schwarzkopf, we have the mightiest military in the world, but we are facing an entirely different kind of enemy now. That's very plain today in the pain and grief that this country is feeling. Are we going to have to realign our military forces?
I don't think we need to realign them, Tom. We have the capability to strike. The question we're going to have difficulty with is finding them. Number one, identifying them, and then number two, finding them and being able to attack them where we find them.
Have you been surprised that despite all the warnings about the vulnerability of this country to terrorism, that both among ordinary people and even in the highest echelons of Congress, people have refused in some sense to take it all very seriously?
Well, you know, we've always had those two great oceans on either side of us to protect us and sort of isolate us from the rest of the world, and they've always been a sort of a sanctuary for us. And with the world getting smaller and smaller due to international transportation and that sort of thing, those are no longer walls that protect us anymore. We need to come to the realization, and you know, terrorism has been alive and well throughout the rest of the world for a very, very long time, and you can point to it in many different places, and it's come to our shores big time now. We need to understand that.
I know that you still have many contacts in the Arab world among the moderate Arab states. Do you think that they will be willing to stand beside the United States now in a conspicuous fashion against this kind of terrorism?
That's going to be very, very tough for them to do. Very, very tough, because, of course, in doing so, the terrorists have always justified their acts against any United States facility because of what the United States support of Israel. And quite frankly, for them to stand up now and support the United States 100% is going to put them in a very, very difficult position with vis-a-vis Israel, because most of those states are anti-Israel.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who's with us tonight as well. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke did make a very appropriate point, because the reaction in this country will be, in many quarters, to lash out at all people of Islamic faith, all practicing Muslims. And there are about 7 million in this country altogether, many of them in the Detroit area, but also throughout the eastern seaboard as well. That would be a grievous error on the part of the United States, because many of these Islamic countries have been the targets of the same kind of terrorism. Egypt particularly, and Saudi Arabia has not been happy with some of the attacks that have been made in that country as well. These are people who operate like loose bands of guerrillas, and they have their own kind of demented and perverted view of what the Islamic faith is all about, and they attempt to gain their revenge against what they describe as their satanic enemies like the United States through these kinds of acts of cowardly terrorism. The Islamic faith is the fastest growing faith in the world, and it's one that cannot be ignored by this country in so many different dimensions. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklashevsky now, who's at the Pentagon. Jim, we know that American military forces are on worldwide alert of the highest order tonight. Anything else for us?
Well, officials here at the Pentagon also at the highest state of alert, Delta, which is essentially virtually at a war footing, Tom, where American military are supposed to be geared up, weapons locked and loaded, ready for absolutely everything. But it's been a full 11 hours since that American Airlines 757 slammed into the Pentagon, and firefighters are having a very difficult time with the stubborn blaze. As you can see behind me now, what were just a couple of flickers on the roof are actually now full-blown infernos, apparently. Flames bursting through the roof, even more so just in the last few minutes as we've been standing here watching, and much further away now than the original fires that we had watched several hours ago. So it appears that the fires here in the Pentagon are not only stubborn, but spreading. At the same time, television crews were permitted in the area just a short time ago, and they recorded a very grisly scene, Tom. What they first saw were some of the dead that had been removed from the rubble, covered in sheets. There's a temporary morgue actually set up in the center courtyard of the Pentagon here. The exact casualty toll still not known, but scores are believed to be dead and still buried underneath the rubble. And there was also some shots of the damage, exterior damage around the building itself. As you can see from the pictures, it's eerily reminiscent, Tom, of the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. The wide gash in the building and the slanted floors that had just collapsed under their own pressure, and it appears that these rescue workers are a long way from not only containing the blaze, but recovering the victims, Tom.
I find that stunning, Jim Miklashevsky, that they've had all day to work on that blaze, and tells you about the very grievous nature of this attack on that building, that they still have flames at this hour burning through the military headquarters of the United States.
Well, actually, Tom, you know, some consider the location where this plane went in rather fortunate, because exactly where the plane went in was an area that had recently been redeveloped and redesigned with very heavy blast walls and fire walls in that new area there. Of course, can't withstand the kind of impact of a 757. So as you look at the building, the fire did not spread very much to the right, the new portion of the building, and the old portion where the fire continues to spread, much of that had already been vacated. Those offices vacated in preparations of the remodeling effort that was to be undertaken in that section of the building. Even though the death toll here is likely to still rise significantly, the number of dead is probably considerably less than it would have been if this part of the Pentagon had been up to full staff. Tom?
And Jim, a lot of people are going to be looking at all that destruction and wonder whether our military capability is in any way compromised by the damage to the building here.
Well, fortunately, too, this is exactly the opposite side of all the critical command centers in the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense's office, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs office, the National Military Command, the tank, you've been there, Tom, where some of the most critical military decisions are made. Fortunately, they were all on the other side of the building, and Secretary Rumsfeld never left the building today. After surveying some of the damage, actually helping some of the injured out on stretchers, he returned, not to his office, but the National Military Command Center to coordinate any kind of military assessments and operations that may be underway. Tom, one indication that some plans are already being considered. 2 aircraft carriers were recently in the Persian Gulf, the Enterprise, the Carl Vinson. The Enterprise had left the Persian Gulf, was scheduled to leave the area, head home and the Navy has told, the Pentagon has told the Enterprise, stay right where you are.
Jim, we do know that the Air Force One had a fighter plane escort when it returned today from the Omaha to Washington leg. Do you think that that might be routine for the foreseeable future?
I would guess that probably will be routine. I mean, we saw the extraordinary scene over here earlier today of American fighter jets, F-16, flying low-level cover over the Capitol and the Pentagon. And I think there will be extraordinary security measures, not only implemented around this building, and they have been stiffened just recently, Tom. All the outside windows have been equipped with Kevlar coating to guard against blast. This portion of the building that have been remodeled, heavy blast walls put in. So they were in the process of trying to make this building terror-proof. It was proven today that that may never be possible.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, who is at the Pentagon tonight. Now let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell, who covers the diplomatic front and national security matters for us as well. Colin Powell, is he back in the nation's capital tonight, Andrea?
Yes, he is back. He had cut short his trip to South America, flew directly from Lima, Peru, back to Washington, and is now at the State Department. He went to meetings with his top team. They were waiting there on the 7th floor of the State Department for him, so he came back without going to Bogota, Colombia. But intelligence officials and others are all, as you know, mobilizing to try to find the culprits. U.S. officials have briefed some members of Congress. What we're learning now from Senator Orrin Hatch, who is a key member of the Judiciary Committee, is that they did have intelligence intercepts. So after the attack, they did pick up some intercepts, and you know the sophistication of the National Security Agency and their ability to intercept communications worldwide, and they zero in, they target bin Laden's operation routinely. They picked up intercepts with some members of his organization apparently referring to these targets having been hit. They've been successful in the past building cases against bin Laden by picking up this kind of information, these kinds of communications. They also believe that at least one person on one of the 4 doomed flights may have been a member of his organization. So as disastrous as this is, they will have leads from people checking into airports, checking on those flights. They know some of the pseudonyms, the aliases, the fake identifications that are used by some of these people. They've probably got a pretty good head start tonight. George Tenet and his officials are all gathered at the CIA in secure areas and are having meetings as we speak.
Andrea Mitchell, are you picking up anything about sending emissaries around the world in an effort to build what has been described as an extraordinary coalition of people to try to build an alliance against the idea of terrorism? Because it's not just the Western democracies that are being threatened by all of this, but as you well know, many of the moderate Arab states have been targets as well.
And as Dick Holbrooke and General Schwarzkopf were talking to you earlier, it's very clear that we are at a very weak moment diplomatically in the Arab world and in the Gulf region. Our best allies, including Saudi Arabia, top leaders have been blunt in telling President Bush and communicating privately with his father, who is, of course, very popular in that area, and talking to other U.S. officials about how displeased they are about the situation with the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians. So there is very little support. Bin Laden is a hero, is in many ways an idol to many people on the street in the Palestinian areas. So while we have to be very careful to make those distinctions with Islamic fundamentalists who have nothing at all to do with Osama bin Laden, to radicals in the region, he is a hero. And he will, of course, be made more of a hero if and when the U.S. retaliates. And as both of your other guests were saying earlier, there is no question in anyone's mind the U.S. is going to retaliate not only against bin Laden, because they don't even know exactly where he is, but most assuredly against the Taliban if they can nail down the evidence that he was responsible, because there's no question that the Taliban have been warned. The U.S. is going to retaliate against Afghanistan itself.
NBC's Andrea Mitchell, thank you very much. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now, who covers the aviation beat for us. And of course, today we did have the fully unexpected and shocking development of these terrorists hijacking 4 airliners simultaneously, 2 American Airlines, 2 United Airlines jetliners bound for California from Boston, Newark, and Washington Dulles. 2 of them going into the World Trade Center, 1 going into the Pentagon, and another crash landing and killing everyone on board outside of Pittsburgh. This was a well-planned, very cold-blooded, extremely well-executed terrorist attack, Robert, and we have been talking tonight about whether we'll have a resumption of air flight in this country anytime tomorrow. This is one more of the exceptional developments. No airplanes were flying after about noon today.
They were talking about resuming flights at noon tomorrow. They say at least that they'll reassess it at that point. And meantime, there's also some new information now that maybe the weapon of choice here seems to have been knives. We know now that there were knives involved on at least 3 of the 4 aircraft that were hijacked and brought down, and there's been no mention yet of anything about guns being used. But first, let's look at the facts of these crashes today. The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, 767, with 92 on board, supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south, directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767, with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 15 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m., American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It too taken over and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well, but crashes short of whatever its intended target is, comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I happened to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching. I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane had made the initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only 2 ways terrorists can sneak themselves or their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the hijackers must have disabled crews and taken over the plane's controls. More likely that than forcing a pilot with a gun at his head to fly right into the World Trade Center, for instance. Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, the controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this. And tonight we're getting reports of cell phone calls from at least 3 of those 4 flights, 1 from a flight attendant and 2 from passengers that were on board the flights. And they all talk about knives. There's, again, no mention of guns. In the first case, it was that flight that came out of Boston, and that was an American Airlines flight, and it was a flight attendant who apparently got a cell phone call off. I've heard variously it was to American Airlines operations or maybe somewhere else, but she reported that her fellow attendants had been stabbed in
the back of the plane, and that the cabin had been taken over, and up front that the crew of the plane had been taken over, and that the plane was going down in New York, was the quote that we heard. Then, on the second flight that came out of Boston, that was the second flight of the day, that was 17 minutes behind that first flight, and also went into one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, there was a businessman who got off 2 cell phone calls to his father. In the first call, he told his father that a flight attendant had been stabbed and the plane had been hijacked. Then the phone went dead. Then he got another call off to his father and said the plane was going down. So that, again, is a plane that went into the second Twin Tower of the World Trade Center. On the third flight of the day to be hijacked, the one that left from Dulles Airport, was supposed to go to San Francisco, instead was taken over, looped around, brought back to the Pentagon. It was Barbara Olson, the CNN commentator and Washington lawyer and the wife of Solicitor General Theodore Olson, who called her husband Theodore twice from the plane before it went down. I'm sorry, I think she called once, but she talked about knife-like instruments being used by the hijackers in the back of the plane, and said that passengers had been forced to the back of the plane. Anyhow, all this talk about knives might suggest that something managed to get through X-rays, and maybe it was thought by the terrorists that it would be easier to get knives through the X-ray machines and not be caught at it than to get guns through. At any rate, we may hear differently later, but so far there's been no mention of guns. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager tonight with that complete wrap-up of the aviation component of all of this. No one could have anticipated that hijacked planes would be used in effect as guided missiles, although Tom Clancy, in one of his very popular books, did have a hijacked plane crashed into the U.S. Capitol. There have been other attempts in the past by other terrorists. You'll remember that there was an attempt to take some planes out of the Philippines and blow them up over the Pacific after the capture of the terrorists who were responsible for the original bombing of the World Trade Center. And there have been other planes as well. An Air India flight was blown up in midair, to say nothing of Pan Am 103, which was blown up over Lockerbie, Scotland, by terrorists widely believed that they were from Libya. And they have gone on trial, obviously, and that killed a great many Americans on that flight as well. So it's not the first time that this has happened, but it's never been used in quite this fashion before. And if you have been impatient with airline and airplane security in the past, wait until there's a resumption of flights. There's going to be a great change in this country. If you fly in the Middle East or through many parts of Europe, you're often several times questioned before you can get on the flight, as well as all the electronic security that you have to go through. You have to get to the airport well in advance of the scheduled departure time of the plane. And those will be some of the new procedures that are bound to be put into effect in this country. El Al, in fact, has undercover people on board, armed, trained sharpshooters who fly on all their international flights. It could come to that in America. One former State Department official was saying today we may even have to have some form of air cover in America, hard as that is to believe. But as you look at these scenes, you know the consequences of not having very tight security at our airports. Let's go to Pat Dawson now, who has been keeping track for us of the rescue efforts downtown and of the fires that continue to burn in Lower Manhattan. Pat?
Tom, we are getting to the point of, I guess, what is best described as an unofficial shift change. We have seen for about the past half hour a number of New York City firefighters principally leaving here, leaving the scene, moving out along with their vehicles. In many cases, those vehicles in total disarray, seriously damaged. We were able to grab one of them to speak to us. This is firefighter Anthony Pasquarelli. Am I getting that right, from Engine 204?
Yes.
Can you tell us, first of all, when you got here?
Approximately 12 o'clock. And like you said, there's no words to describe what happened. There's numerous companies that are still in there. And, you know.
Now, have you heard the reports? We have heard a report from the New York City Firefighters Union that perhaps as many as half of the original firefighters who responded, perhaps as many as 10 or 11 companies, perhaps 200 men, have been lost.
We operate inside the building, you know, so it's a possibility. Nobody wants a hope. I'm hoping everybody pulls through, you know. Hopefully God's with us. So.
Is that word making its way through amongst the rescue workers through the afternoon?
No, nobody's going to say anything until they have a definite answer. Like I said, everybody hopes that everyone pulls through. Nobody wants to come up with a number yet. We're still hopeful.
Tell me what is going on in there over the last 2 or 3 hours. Are you still fighting fires in there?
Yes, there's numerous high-rises that are still on fire that we're trying to battle, and we can't get close to it because of rubble piled up as much as 100 feet. So it's just a tremendous effort with all the agencies of the city.
How many firefighters would you say and other rescue workers are in there working on these fires?
Like I said, it's hard to say. This is probably 3/4 of the city here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were pulling people off vacation, whoever wasn't working. So
the fire's still burning in there. Have you heard of any buildings that may still be in danger?
No, none at this time. The last one, I believe, was 7 World Trade over here, and nothing at this time, though.
Yeah. You said the rubble. If you give me some idea of the rubble, how big it is, how much there is. I mean, the thought of 100
blocks. It's a 40-story building, and both World Trade Centers and all the little buildings that were surrounding. It's just blocks of rubble. There's no way to describe it unless you're actually up there looking at it. They're sending everybody back to get rest because, like I said, the city's hurting for members, and they're going to need everyone fresh for the rest of the city. God forbid something happens anywhere else. So they're returning companies to get rest and wash up at the firehouse, but we have to stay at the firehouse, in case anything happens. So.
Firefighter Anthony Pasquarelli, thank you so much. We know it's been a very difficult day for you. Thank you. Firefighter Anthony Pasquarelli, the New York Fire Department, Engine 204, who, as he said, has been here, Tom, since about noon this afternoon. He relays the information that is not terribly optimistic in the fact that they are still fighting fires in there, and they are having a very, very difficult time getting to them because of the enormous amount of debris. As he described, a 40-story skyscraper and 2 110-story towers coming down. The debris, obviously, extraordinarily difficult to work your way through. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. Pat Dawson, still on the scene in Midtown Manhattan. We want to share with you just some of the president's speech that he made to the nation tonight at 8:31 from the Oval Office after a day in which he flew from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and then on to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, where in a secure bunker he conducted a national security meeting and then flew back to Washington because he felt that it was important to address this nation on this night from the Oval Office, the symbol of power and presidential authority. Here is some of what the president had to say tonight.
This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
And the president also said that we will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I've asked former UN Ambassador Richard Holbrooke to join us once again. He was the principal architect, of course, of the Dayton Peace Accords. And I think, Richard, for a lot of Americans, there must be a great deal of confusion tonight about the Islamic radicals around the world and then Islamic fundamentalists and other people who have, this is the fastest growing faith in the world after all, and who do feel, if not strongly allied with America, they feel strongly that this act of terrorism that has been visited upon this country today is intolerable and unacceptable.
Well, that's right, Tom. And as you said earlier in this program, the overwhelming majority of people of Islamic faith, including the 7 million Islamic Americans, do not share this philosophy or advocate these acts, and it is vitally important to recognize that to be a member of that faith is not to be associated with this horrible deed. To your point, there has been a growing fundamentalism in the world for many years, which you have covered in many areas of the world. Now we face its consequences at home at a level that is without precedent in American history. I have no doubt that the United States government will, when it decides how to respond, And I think it's very important, as you just pointed out, that President Bush tonight said that they would make no distinction between the people who committed the act and those who harbor it. And I think for your viewers, it's important to underscore that if, in fact, it's Osama bin Laden, as you have reported seems likely, then the Taliban and other governments in Afghanistan and the region who have harbored these people are going to face the same consequences. I think the rules of the game are going to shift because of this. One last point on this, Tom, and that is the international side of it. We cannot do this alone. We need the support of our allies. We need the support of Russia, which has often played both sides, of China, which has stayed too much to the sidelines. And finally, we need to work with the moderate Arab states who must be as upset as we are in some ways at what happened, but don't like to show any break in the solidarity at times with the fundamentalists. And this is going to be very tricky, particularly for countries like Jordan and Egypt.
And Richard, the President has a fairly full agenda this fall. He is, after all, scheduled to go to China. Would you expect that they'll keep that agenda in place?
I have no doubt he'll continue his trip to China. That is a summit of all Pacific nations. Presidential leadership requires rallying other countries. He's got a very important first appearance at the United Nations coming up in 15 days. I assume he will go ahead with that, although having spoken to Secretary General Kofi Annan a few hours ago, I can tell you that he is already concerned about both the security and political aspects of the big meetings coming up in New York. But I assume he'll go ahead to China, and it's a good place to continue to rally international opinion in order to take concerted action so that this kind of thing is not permitted to succeed.
All right. Richard Holbrooke, our former ambassador to the United Nations, former ambassador to Germany, high-ranking official in the State Department in the Jimmy Carter administration as well, and as I said earlier, the principal architect of the Dayton Peace Accords, in which the United States took, in that case, the side of Muslims who were under assault in Bosnia. Let's go now to General Norman Schwarzkopf, who is going to join me now in a kind of video tour that is going to be painful for him and for all Americans. We're going to look at the military headquarters of the United States that was attacked today. General, we're going to take you inside via video camera to show you the extent of the damage that was done there. Fires continue to burn in the Pentagon tonight. These are the outer rings of the Pentagon on the heliport side across that very large and substantial building from where Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has his office, and the Joint Chiefs, Hugh Shelton and others, have their offices. When you look at that, General Schwarzkopf, as a career military man, what goes through your mind?
Well, you know, Tom, I spent 3 tours in the Pentagon, and I know exactly where that spot is. The interesting part about that is right across the highway on the other side is Arlington National Cemetery, where an awful lot of great Americans who have served their country are laid to rest. Hearing about the rings, the fact that it went in, you know, there are 5 rings there, and the fact that it hit on the outside, first of all, it's amazing that the pilot could have come in the level he did and hit it without hitting something ahead of time. It was obviously a very experienced pilot, but then the fact that the fire has continued to go in through 5 different layers. You have 5 layers of offices that have just been taken out on both sides and down the middle. It just blows your mind.
General, the military around the world is in highest possible alert. How long can we sustain that kind of an alert?
Oh, we can sustain it for a good deal of time. They're used to being in a high state of alert. It just means that they take a lot more security precautions. A lot of the aircraft, for instance, are loaded up with weapons so that they can respond immediately. But it's not something that wears you out right away. I mean, you can stay at that state of alert for quite some time.
You know, the President tonight promised that we would seek out and attack not just the terrorists, but any nation that harbored them as well. That is, and I'm not belittling what he had to say here, but that is easier said than done. There has still been not brought to justice the terrorists who were responsible for the attack on the USS Cole, and there was a pretty big fingerprint on that one.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. As I said earlier, finding them is part of the problem. You can identify the organization clearly, but it's an awful big world out there and an awful lot of places to hide. And you got to know exactly where they are before you're going to be able to hit them. So That's a really, really tough intelligence problem. You know, no terrorist operation can survive without a support base. There's no doubt in my mind that there's some place within our country right now, there's some people who supported those terrorists prior to the time they went and got in those airplanes. And those are the people, too, that you have to find.
Was there anything when you were commander of Southern Command and based in Florida that made you more anxious than the possibility of a terrorist attack on this country, even though you were responsible for American military forces in another part of the world?
Well, I think I was more concerned for the military forces in the other parts of the world. At that time, you know, again, we all had the mentality that nobody was going to come over here and hit one of our major headquarters in this country. There were a lot of targets. Khobar Towers is a typical example of a type of target that was over there that could have been hit by terrorists, was hit by terrorists, and you really concerned yourself more with those forces over there than I never worried about my own headquarters. You know, it was just something that wasn't going to happen.
General, we have trained generations of military leaders to adapt to the changing times. We now have the military leaders who are coming out of our service academies who are so familiar with modern warfare that is conducted by computer and technology and laser-guided missiles and that kind of thing. Are we going to have to develop new courses and new disciplines at the service academies for fighting terrorism?
Tom, we've got some outstanding military units out there that are fully prepared to take on the terrorists on the ground in any kind of fighting they want to fight the battle. Yeah, there's an awful lot of technology involved in the business of war fighting, but there's an awful lot of the warrior spirit that's involved too. And we've got special operations forces, we've got ranger forces, we've got special operations forces in all of our services that are very, very capable of taking on the terrorists, you know, by their rules or ours. So once we find them, you know, we'll be ready to deal with them. There's absolutely no question in my mind about that.
If you were back in the Pentagon and someone said we're going to have to put a military component into commercial airline security in this country, either in the skies or on the ground, would you be for or against that?
Well, you know, it's sort of it rubs me the wrong way. A lot of people said that about the drug war. You know, we ought to have a soldier with a bayonet standing on every street corner in the United States of America, and I'm very uncomfortable with that from a constitutional standpoint. On the other hand, we do have some people, some very, very highly trained people that could perform that role very, very well if indeed we decided to put somebody like that in each of our aircraft.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf. Yes.
Can I give you one more observation, which I think is very pertinent?
Absolutely.
You know, in the Gulf War, some of the people today criticize what we did in Iraq. We went to extraordinary ends in the Gulf War, even endangering our own forces more so to avoid attacking innocent civilians. And yet what these bastards have done is deliberately attacked innocent civilians, and that's the difference between them and us.
Well put, General Schwarzkopf, as usual. And of course, a lot of people have been talking today about the comparison between Pearl Harbor and this attack. It is the most serious attack since Pearl Harbor, but that was a military attack on a military installation, and we knew exactly who was responsible for it at that time. So this is a whole different order of magnitude, and I'm afraid that this is going to be a very dark day in America for a long, long time, and the consequences are yet to be resolved for all of us. We want to share with you now just what kind of a surrealistic day this was over lower Manhattan. There is the plane that comes in for the second attack on the South Tower. It appears to have gone all the way through. We don't know whether it was just the fireball that did that. It was fully loaded with fuel for a transcontinental flight, and that plane, which also had its origins, as I remember now, in Boston, flew right into the South Tower of the World Trade Center about 20 minutes after the first plane flew into the tower that you see just before you. And then, of course, which was unexpected to many of us in terms of how swiftly it happened, they came down. There are some haunting and poignant stories of people on cell phones calling 2 friends or loved ones in the World Trade Center when all of that was going on. One woman, a nurse that Robert Bazell talked to at St. Vincent's Hospital, was online with her husband, who was in the first building on the top floor when it was hit, and they had an exchange, and then the line went dead. There were other indications of people saying, "I love you," and the line going dead. And perhaps, for me at least, the most unsettling thought of the day of all was one man who described going down through the darkened and very wet stairwell because of the sprinklers that had gone off, and seeing people who were trapped in their wheelchairs, the large mobilized wheelchairs that couldn't fit into the stairwell, and certainly the elevators were not working. He got out, and shortly after that, that building came down. It was that kind of a day, and there are going to be so many more of those stories, an untold number at this hour, hundreds, perhaps thousands. Dateline's Jane Pauley takes us through some of the horror of this day and what happened at the World Trade Center.
The mighty World Trade Center tumbling down. Oh my God! Everyday New Yorkers had to run for their lives. How fragile the city seemed today. We deployed a team of Dateline staffers to bring us images of a city under siege on handheld digital cameras.
What I saw today on the streets of Manhattan really were the extremes of New York. It's the best and the worst of people.
I got 20 blocks away when the smell and the taste really hit me. Way in the distance, the huge cloud on the horizon, but I could taste and smell something that was like the worst electrical fire ever imaginable.
They brought us a startling glimpse of what it was like to be at ground zero of a major terrorist attack.
What's it like down there?
Save 6 people. I tried my best to try to save everybody.
First, get away, then get home. Businesses were closed and buildings evacuated. Thousands upon thousands were left to negotiate a maze of closed streets and suspended services.
He disappeared and everybody starts running. And I didn't know if my dad is going to have a father, if I have my husband anymore.
There was a real sense of panic on the streets among the tens of thousands of pedestrians, and it was easy to see why. Look to the horizon on the south and you see an enormous gray-black cloud from the explosion.
As they moved towards safety uptown, people tried to keep up with the flurry of events any way they could. Even the wounded walked. This woman was on the 19th floor of the World Trade Center when the first explosion hit. Hurt, but lucky to get out before the building collapsed. We found her 30 blocks north, heading to Bellevue Medical Center.
A huge cloud of gray, huge cloud of gray came and everyone started running and stampeding and everyone was falling on the ground. And I don't know what knocked me over. I don't know if it was a person or just the force of the wind. But I fell down, I just covered my head. I prayed that a building wouldn't fall on me and I really thought I was gonna die.
Doctors and medical students lined up like extras on the set of a disaster movie. Almost immediately after the attack, along with all 3 major airports, the city's subways, bridges, tunnels, and major highways were all closed. The FDR Drive, normally a winding snarl of congested traffic, empty. Thousands of commuters from New York's outer boroughs were left stranded in Manhattan. By mid-afternoon, a police officer on the scene estimated that more than 20,000 people had crossed the 59th Street Bridge on foot. Meanwhile, Grand Central Station was jammed, but the trains were running until noon.
I remember standing in Grand Central and watching a man and a woman just scream and embrace each other and feel relief. I felt their relief to see each other again. After people had been managing to get out for about 15 minutes, all of a sudden they announced that they were evacuating the building, and people were ordered to get out immediately, and workers in their orange vests were running for the exits, and we didn't know what was going on. We just ran with them.
Confused passengers poured out of the building after a bomb threat.
It hit me that this building really could blow up, and I was scared. I was afraid that the building literally could blow up underneath my feet.
All around the city, it was a mass migration of hundreds of thousands of people, but uncannily quiet. Perhaps it was the unspeakable horrors many had seen.
It was orderly, but it was chaotic. People were shocked. Everyone was dazed. People didn't really want to look each other in the eye, I think, for fear of breaking down. The question on everybody's lips seemed to be, what is going on, and is there more of it that's going to come?
This was supposed to be Election Day in New York. As if anyone took note, it was officially called off. Everything was. What was open was tightly locked down.
What's that?
Can't be doing no pictures.
Okay, it's NBC
My point,
News.
Don't you understand?
It's NBC News.
I don't care who it is.
Security at all buildings that might be targets was extremely tight. Our own building, the famous tourist destination at Rockefeller Plaza, was evacuated, but for NBC's news operations to bring you this story. And all over Manhattan, there was this strange sort of gridlock.
The uptown avenues in Manhattan have been turned into virtual parking lots as everyone tries to flee northward. Meanwhile, the downtown avenues have all been sealed off, but for emergency vehicles.
Cell phone service came and went. Anxious people called their loved ones the old-fashioned way. Sometimes that didn't work either.
People were forced to use payphones, which is kind of a joke in Manhattan because it's hard to find a payphone that works.
The only thing that was easy today was getting lost in the scramble.
She doesn't have a cell phone. They don't work anyway. She is not mobile because she's got emphysema and she can't walk very fast.
David Douglas's 64-year-old mother lives in an apartment building just 4 blocks from the World Trade Center. Soon after the attack, she had chest pains. So he flagged a passing car and the driver headed for the nearest hospital.
But I said, look, lady, please, my mom can't walk. Please, please just take her north as much as you can because she can't breathe well.
He tried to follow on his rollerblades, but lost track of the car and spent the rest of the day searching hospitals.
So I just want to know, is there any system of finding people with...
Well, they're doing the best. We're doing the best we can. It's pretty chaotic.
He searched family reunion centers.
Lucille Lobato. A-B-A-T-O.
And even public schools, desperate to find his mother.
Are there any people being kept here?
Finally, after 4 hours of futile searching, he called home. There was a message on his answering machine.
It's my mom.
She was safe, staying with a friend in his very own apartment building.
She's in my building.
For 2 New Yorkers, a small moment of comfort in a day when so many others will find none.
Not just me and you, but all these...
We could all use a little good news, and that is so typical of New York. It's the tough guy city in terms of a reputation, but of course it's got a tender heart. Chris Colvin, one of my colleagues, told me tonight that there are reports as well of very long lines outside all the blood banks in the city because the line has gone out that they do need blood, and in fact they've turned them away in some instances. And I had here a moment ago, let me find it, there's been a call that has gone out for medical personnel, particularly for physicians. Doctors in and near New York City, contact 518-431-7600 if you can offer assistance. Medical personnel are needed. The number is, see if we can get this on the screen later, 1-800-628-0193. As you might expect with all the medical facilities in New York City, the doctors and the medical personnel are overtaxed, to say the very least. So they're looking for physicians in the city. Many of them who are not emergency room physicians, have their own private practices, are asked to respond to the hospitals of their choice as well. MSNBC's Edie Magnus is in Pennsylvania now, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh, where one of those planes went into the ground today. It did not hit a target of any kind, and she has the latest for us now. Edie?
Tom,
Tom, I'm on a country road that goes between the towns of Lambertsville and Shanksville in Pennsylvania. And beyond all of these lights you see, the glare of the media satellite trucks, it is a very dark night here in the country, but it is very busy. About a half a mile to a mile or so beyond, just over my shoulder, sort of where you see all those trucks headed down in an open field of an old strip mine, is where lies the wreckage of United Flight 93, which of course, as you all have been reporting, took off from Newark, destined for San Francisco, never got there. 38 passengers, 7 crew, no survivors. The debris here is spread over a 3 to 4 mile radius, which has now been completely sealed off and is being treated, according to the FBI, as a crime scene. Governor Tom Ridge made some remarks earlier at a press conference. He had flown over the site. He said the emergency response here was immediate. He also said, and I don't know whether or not you all are able to see pictures of this, but this is one of those cases where the pictures really do tell the story, that sort of the most horrifying aspect of this particular crash scene is how little debris is visible. There is a large crater in the ground, and I'm hoping that you all are seeing it as I'm talking about it, but that's really all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris. There has been at least one report that the investigators out there, and there are hundreds of them, as I said tonight, have found nothing larger than a phone book. You spoke a little bit ago, Tom, about the haunting cell phone conversations, the most tantalizing story to emerge from this particular crash is coming not from here, but from elsewhere, and it is a story of a cell phone conversation. A passenger on United Flight 93 apparently locked himself in a bathroom and called 911 and got an emergency dispatch operator and told them the plane had been hijacked. The FBI here is not talking about it at all. They were merely say they are aware of that conversation and they are trying to gather evidence about it, which presumably means that there may well be a tape and somebody hopefully is listening to it. What else is happening here tonight? Forensic archaeologists, according to the FBI, are gridding out the scene. Their main thrust, of course, is just to protect it, and they're trying to secure buildings in the area here where tomorrow they can begin to remove evidence and look at it and, of course, remove the bodies. Tom?
All right, thanks very much. Dateline's Edie Magnus, who is in Pennsylvania tonight, outside the site of the crash of that plane that went into the ground. United had simply lost track of it for a time. It was a flight that left Newark. It was bound for San Francisco. As Edie reported to us, at one point, one of the passengers on board, locked in the bathroom, said, "We're being hijacked, we're being hijacked. This is not a joke." And the plane disappeared shortly after that. Financial markets have opened in Asia, and they're taking a hammering, as you might expect. We are already in a very difficult global economy. Japan has not been doing well. Now, America's financial markets have been closed and will remain closed tomorrow. And the Nikkei index is getting, as I say, hammered in the opening hours. CNBC's Ron Insana, who had a perilous day today, just barely escaping from the collapse of that building in lower Manhattan, is with us now, and he's wearing his financial reporter's hat. Can we expect this around the world for the next several days, Ron?
Well, certainly for the next several hours, Tom. After a half-hour delay in Tokyo, the Nikkei there has fallen in excess of 600 points. At one juncture tonight, Tom, the Nikkei was below the Dow. That is the first time that has happened since 1957, a roughly 6% decline right now. Markets from Australia to Tokyo to Shanghai, all down roughly 6%. Monetary officials and other economic officials throughout the region saying they will do what is necessary to restore stability to the markets. That usually means pumping cash into the economy to make sure this decline doesn't get fully out of control.
And what about tomorrow? The markets will be closed here as well, but what about other financial institutions like banks and communities across America? Most of them were open today. would we expect they'll be open tomorrow as well?
I suspect so, Tom. With respect to the financial markets, there is this one-day closure, something we have not seen actually since the end of World War II. But it would appear that Federal Reserve officials would like to see the banks fully functioning. It is not the type of event where you would want necessarily to take a bank holiday and create a sense of panic among consumers who are already clearly uncertain about the economic outlook in the wake of today's tragedy. So the banks, we understand, will likely be open, but the financial markets, as you say, will be closed. Now, how the financial markets do in Europe will also be a key test for what happens here when they do reopen on Wall Street 1, 2, or 3 days from now.
One of your colleagues at the other end of the day is David Faber of CNBC. He's on Squawk Box, of course, which plays before the markets open most morning. Big problem in this country, as you know better than I do, with consumer confidence. There are a lot of CEOs tonight and their principal officers and a lot of boards of directors, I would think, are having emergency meetings about how they're going to deal with this dislocation in the American economy, David.
There's no doubt about that, Tom. In fact, there's a lot of concern overall about corporate confidence and consumer confidence, something we've all been focused on in terms of where this economy stands right now. As we pointed out many times, the consumer has sort of kept us out of recession potentially. The question is, what will be the reaction to this tragedy today on the consumer front? And of course, the confidence of CEOs and corporations is also going to be sorely tested. I've spoken to a number of the senior executives at a few of the big investment banks, the big commercial banks, and they're certainly worried. They aren't concerned about the financial system suffering over the long term, but they do admit that there are going to be some fairly significant short-term disruptions in the financial systems from things such as just check processing and the fact that a lot of that went on down in Lower Manhattan. People who want their money in other parts of the country may have to wait. Securities processing and things of that nature, the settlement of trades, all of these things, the guts of our financial system in a way, were involved in this area. Many of them, unfortunately, in the very buildings that collapsed and others around them as well.
And we don't know yet, do we, for sure, how much damage may have been done to some of the circuitry of the market?
We don't, Tom, and that's a good point. We simply won't know, as we've heard from so many of the reports from people on site. They can't get that close to many of the structures that are still burning. There is a concern about the telecommunications network in the area and whether that, in fact, could be impacted to a large extent. Many institutions, both foreign and domestic, rely on the ability to transfer funds in and out of that area as well. Hard to say at this point where that stands. And as well, the back office, the keeping track of all of the processing that goes on, that a lot of firms had in the World Trade Center, other firms that were even headquartered there also, questions about all of those kind of things. Certainly they pale in comparison to the human tragedy here, but they will be things that have to be dealt with in the days and weeks ahead.
Thank you, David Faber.